this story starts with Ron Wyden visiting, and I can't remember the second lawmaker now, visiting Murkowski from Alaska, visiting Joe Manchin when he's like in year 2 of his Senate stint. Take it from there.
Yeah, this is in 2012, and Wyden, it's before the 2012 election. Wyden and Murkowski are vying essentially to become the chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. If the Democrats win and held the Senate, then Wyden would become the chair. The Republicans overtake the Democrats and take the Senate. Murkowski is going to become the chair of that committee. And Manchin invites both of them to tour energy facilities in West Virginia. And all of them, there's, I guess, a solar facility all the way down to a coal plant. And when I talked to Wyden about this, he's like, I asked him, are you sure you really want me to tour a coal plant? But he did. And these facilities were scattered all over West Virginia. So they're in like a bus or something, or some kind of van. And it's the 3 senators. And Wyden just sort of gets to talking with Manchin about the future of energy and what he'd like to see. And he finds an opening to pitch this idea of which would eventually become a bill called the Clean Energy for America Act. And what it basically says is that, in the past, there were literally over 40 different tax credits for various types of energy. A tax credit for solar, a tax credit for wind, a tax credit for production, a tax credit for installation. And none of them worked together, and they all were short term and had to be, there was always a mad scramble at the end of the year to renew some of these tax credits. And it was just like not an intelligent system. It wasn't really designed very well. It was just sort of a grab bag of different tax credits. And Wyden said to Manchin, what if we just change this completely and made it emissions led, so that whatever reduces emissions can get the tax credit? And Manchin kind of perked up and he said, does that mean carbon capture? Does that mean hydrogen? And Wyden said, yeah, if it reduces emissions, we're going to incentivize it. And that's really the origin of what would become the Inflation Reduction Act's climate piece, which the bulk of it are these tax credits that redesign that tax credit system and enhance it and give these tax credits based on emissions reduction for fuels, for energy efficiency, and for power.
All right. And I just want to make sure that people understand this distinction here. The difference is, instead of targeting tax credits on specific mechanisms to reduce emissions, it basically says you get tax credits as long as there's emissions reductions. And is there a threshold? In other words, it's like, if I'm putting half of a pound, if I'm putting just a milliliter less emissions, do I get a tax credit, or is there a threshold? There has to be X amount, or is it prorated relative to the reduction in emissions?
I think it's any reduction. I don't know the parameters of that necessarily. What I do know is that the tax credits continue until overall emissions go to a level that is stipulated specifically, that is consistent with the climate goals. So instead of these tax credits expiring in a year or expiring in 2 years, they are guaranteed to go for a decade and or more, as long as there is a continued need to cut emissions to improve or mitigate the effects of climate change. And
we should say that that provision is analogous to like the idea of economic stabilizers. Like certain things will kick in if inflation, if unemployment reaches certain levels. I mean, where that way it's sort of like idiot proof. and political proof in some level, right? It's like,
well, it just doesn't go away. I mean,
right.
And
it doesn't have to be renewed.
Yeah. If you're an energy investor and you want to invest in a wind farm, but you're not sure if the tax credit is going to be available by the time the wind farm is done, because it technically expires within a year, you're not going to invest in that wind farm.
Right.
And so this clarifies that, yes, this investment is available. You're going to get the benefits of it, and you can go ahead.
Let's talk about the Waxman-Markey bill. Mm-hmm. This was introduced back during the Obama administration.
Yeah, 2009, 2010. Yeah,
and Wyden, in trying to fashion what ultimately became some of the climate provisions in the IRA, saw the failure of Waxman-Markey and learned from that. What was the failure? And in some respects, it's completely shifted. It's both shifted, I think, like the approach to dealing with climate in terms of like legislation, but also I think there's a bigger lesson there too, it seems to me, in terms of like, we saw it in the context of the IRA writ large, which is like, you're better off, and also I guess because of reconciliation, you're better off spending towards a goal rather than trying to pull back in some areas.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And you actually have to go back to the Clinton effort to pass what was called the BTU tax, which was a tax on the heat content of energy. And that failed pretty miserably in 1993. Cap and trade was sort of the function that was used in Waxman-Markey, but it had the same essential goal of putting a cap on climate emission producing energy. And the way it did it was through a market mechanism where there was this cap, but if you were under a certain emissions level, you could trade credits to other higher polluting entities. And as long as you stayed under that emissions cap, everything was good. So this was essentially a way to produce a tax on carbon without actually producing it. But I think the lesson that was taken was that these things weren't working because you just couldn't sell them. Putting a price on energy was kind of the worst possible way to rally a group of lawmakers around an idea. It fed into the Republican notion that you're taxing energy, you're going to increase home electric bills, you're going to increase gas prices, and that wasn't something that was easily overcome. And so, there were even states, like liberal states like Washington State, which tried to pass a carbon tax, a price on carbon, and it failed, even in a very liberal state at the ballot box. And so it just didn't add up as an idea that had political traction. Maybe in a lab, an economist said this is the most efficient way to reduce carbon emissions, but in the real world, it was not something that could be done.
And so we evolved from Waxman-Markey, and you recount sort of the way that this worked into what slowly became the Green New Deal, which was much more oriented towards spending, focusing on the spending as a way of both providing benefits to people, which is easier for politicians to sort of like, I guess, accept and buy, because I'm going to be able to tell my constituents, look here's funding for new jobs, or here's funding for this. Exactly. And it's interesting because I think another area where I see the efficacy of this type of thing in terms of its policy impact, and in this instance, it was to the detriment, I believe, but the Gates Foundation poured, I think, close to like, was it like $1 billion in an experiment on the West Coast of like some schools back in the aughts, and then probably deployed a couple other billions of dollars to sort of like encourage education to move towards the whole sort of like value added teaching and high stakes testing. And it was very effective in moving education policy for the worst, we should say. I want to make this absolutely clear. Like the Rand Corporation was hired by the Gates Foundation to assess their own project. And, in 2017, I think it was, came back and said, yeah, total failure. We should have never done this. Listen to educators. But the two lessons from that are, one, you should not have a billionaire who on a whim thinks that he knows education, even though he doesn't, and you don't have a bunch of stakeholders in there who can set him straight. But two, if you deploy a big chunk of money in a certain area, you can certainly influence a whole sector. Education's massive. Even if there's a lot of other spending going on in there, a chunk of concentrated money can really move things in a specific direction.
Sure. And I mean, you can pick a better example than Bill Gates and schools. I mean, the reason it's called the Green New Deal, it actually has links in this sense, in the investment sense, to many of the items that were in the original New Deal, things like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and other interventions that were just funding things to get projects off the ground and enable more job creation. Now, the difference is that the initial Green New Deal saw them as investments, as grants, as direct investments. This is smuggled in through the tax code, which is just, it was following a well-worn path. Path dependency, I think, is a big thing to think about in the context of this story. It was following the path of the production tax credits, the investment tax credits, the things that we already had. It was just clarifying them and making them smarter, essentially. And but that creates a bit of a problem. I mean, right now, the most important agency in the federal government with respect to climate is the Treasury Department, because they're the ones that are going to set the rules for all of these various tax credits, not just the tax credits on, emissions reduction that we've been talking about, but the electric vehicle tax credits as well. These point of sale rebates that are supposed to be given to people who buy electric vehicles, which have certain attributes to them, certain homegrown or friendly grown battery component and supply chain and things like that. So, what does that mean? It creates a power center within the government in Treasury, which, Treasury is kind of the most friendly government or friendly agency to the sort of economic style of thinking, the kind of neoliberal style of thinking. So what is that going to manifest with these tax credits? We'll have to see. But it's distorting. They're not experts on climate. I mean,
right.
The Treasury officials are not experts on climate, and yet we are forcing them to be so because there's a comfort level in Congress with doing everything through the tax code.
What now? Why? I mean, I know it's path dependency, but it's because there's already an apparatus there, and
it's something that lawmakers can understand. We've passed the investment tax credit before. I've been to my district and I've talked to people in the wind and energy industry who tell me they got benefits from that tax credit. So I can sell this to them as we're doing it even better for you. It has a pedigree, it has a track record, and they feel like they can grasp onto that and understand it. So policy innovation is very hard to get through Congress because members of Congress just fall back on what they know.
At one point, you had a quote in your piece. As you were talking about the Green New Deal and how it mutated into how it manifests itself in the IRA, which, it comes through the tax code, as you say. Mm-hmm. But you were talking about Coons and Warner, who you rightly say often viewed skeptically by the left. Yes, I think that is the case. I think that's very diplomatic. And you interviewed somebody who said one progressive involved with climate policy put it this way: we call it industrial policy. They think of it as industry. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I'm specifically talking about the kinds of investments that they were in favor of during this process, which did get into the bill. Things like the Green Bank, which is a lending institution that's fronted by about $27 billion in seed capital that can make, investments, can make lending to green projects, renewable energy or what have you. And then they cycle that through and continue lending as it circulates through the economy, probably get a 10-to-1 investment boost on that, and it probably can lend $250 billion in lending for green energy. The Coons Warner side of that sees that as, oh, well, that's very responsible. It means that we're creating lending institutions for this purpose, and we'll make back our seed capital, and it'll make money, and it's doing well by doing good, as the Clinton administration was so fond of saying. For the left, it's finally the federal government is playing a role in, this was kind of derided as picking winners and losers in the past, but it's saying we prioritize these particular industries, and we are going to create the conditions for those industries to thrive in the United States, in domestic production, manufacturing, with good paying jobs. And so both sides can take something from that. One side says, oh, this is a market-based mechanism for this kind of development. And the other side says this is, government-directed investment in industries that we favor. And both sides can take that and run with it.
So this is basically, it's industrial policy. It's just the tool is a little bit more friendly to neoliberals on some level.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And how much? Where is this Green Bank? Who manages it?
Well, I don't think we have that answer yet, but there's also an energy loan program that's being boosted in its funding out of the Department of Energy. Okay. So that one we do know where it's coming from. The Green Bank, that's a good question. I don't think we've had the full implementation of that yet, so we don't know exactly whether that's going to be some sort of quasi-governmental entity, sort of outside of government, like a Fannie Mae kind of thing. We'll see.
All right. And then we go through the IRA, and essentially what you argue is that the presidential primary ended up being almost like a rolling think tank for ideas around climate, of which a lot of these emanated.
Yeah. I think you have to go back a little bit. So the climate movement, there's sort of these what I detail in the bill in the story is there's sort of these parallel movements happening. Inside Congress, you have Wyden sort of putting together this clean energy tax program for energy investment and picking up sponsors and talking to Manchin, doing all that. On the outside groups, climate groups, were kind of adrift after Waxman-Markey. They didn't really know which way to go. There were a lot of groups that were just sort of lashing out with rage. You have the youth climate strike. You have, people getting, chaining themselves to the White House gate and getting arrested. You have, even at a higher level, places, people like the Sierra Club and their Beyond Coal campaign, which was litigating to shut down coal plants. But there wasn't sort of a unifying, like, what is the strategy? What is the bill? What are we going to do? And so there were these convenings of all of these groups in 2017, 2018, 2019, to determine, like, what is our strategy? What is our plan? And what they came up with, I think, was enhanced by the presidential race. When Jay Inslee, his campaign was pretty much unilaterally climate focused. And a lot of the people who came out of his campaign joined a group called Evergreen, which was one of the more influential groups on this particular bill. Jamal Rad is the executive director. He was, a top official for Inslee in the campaign. There were all of these new ideas that I think Inslee raised the bar. It was similar, actually, in 2008 to when John Edwards put out his healthcare plan. And then every other candidate had to put out a healthcare plan that was somewhere in the range of where Edwards had set the bar. And I think a similar dynamic happened in 2019, 2020 during the presidential primary. Inslee puts out this plan that was the gold standard, has everything that environmentalists would ever want. And so the other campaigns had to keep up. They had to set get somewhere near that level or above that level. And so it was a virtuous circle of creating of ideas. The one thing I would say is that the climate group's strategy was really a three-pronged strategy. It was about investment, which was, similar to what Wyden was talking about. It was about justice, which was some of the environmental justice measures and also measures for labor for a sort of just transition. And that's partially in the bill. There's some prevailing wage standards that are in the tax credits. They're sort of embedded in there. And some money for environmental justice, about $60 billion. And then the third prong was standards. And this was really informed by state level efforts to do renewable energy standards. Like, we have to get all power plants to 100% renewable energy by 2040 or 85% by 2035 or, whatever the numbers is. But these were happening at the state level, and they wanted to bring that over to a federal standard. Initially, the bill did have something like that. The problem is reconciliation creates a situation where you can't do a regulatory kind of standard like that. You have to jury rig it to make it something close to what would be budgetary. And so they came up with this thing called the Clean Energy Performance Program, which would pay utilities that got above a certain level of renewable mix into their portfolio, and would punish utilities that didn't get to that level. And this was intended to get us, I think, 80% by 2030, something like that. Tina Smith, who I talked to in this story, was the senator who put that forward. Unfortunately, Manchin was like, no, that's out. We don't want to do that. And it's not clear that it would have passed the parliamentarian either. So instead of investment justice standards, we got investment, a little bit of justice, and more investment.
All right, and I just want to reiterate that. I mean, that part of the piece was fascinating to me, where Tina Smith said something to the effect of, like, you don't want to be the sacrificial lamb or policy, but it may have helped, like, give momentum to the rest of the bill. And it also
and it was a new thing, right? So, like, newness was unfamiliar, but it did draw a lot of fire from the electricity industry, from oil and gas. And, that fire was drawn away from the other stuff that was in the bill. And so inevitably, when that got jettisoned, the rest of the bill could move on.
That I find, that dynamic is fascinating. because, I mean, aside from the idea of like, oh, we want to impose standards. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, sorry, because we have this bizarre rule about the way that we're going to pass things, because we have this ridiculous filibuster. We can't just do standards. You have to dress them up as like some type of incentive structure through the tax code so that it affects the budget. It'll be questionable whether it's there, but of course, then you offend Joe Manchin sensibilities because he doesn't want to. He wants it all to be neutral again, where you're not punishing specific technologies and delivering energy, but rather just emissions. And so there you can't impose standards, really. But that idea of drawing fire, I think, is really instructive, particularly, from folks who are outside of the thing. Like I've used this analogy in the past. You understand this dynamic. I used to write scripts for networks. And I would, when I started to wise up after, I don't know, the second or third script, I started to put fake scenes into the script so that they could say, like, do you really think this fits in there? And I'd be like, I hadn't thought about it, but I think you're right. And they get their, they get their sort of like, pound of flesh, essentially, from me. But in this instance, this drew fire, and there's only so many resources that these lobbyists have, and they will they're attracted to the shiny thing or to the potentially more devastating thing, and it drew fire, and it basically let the rest of the stuff skirt through, because a lobbyist can't go like, we want to kill everything. They have to prioritize too politically. Right.
You saw this in a smaller way at the end of the process. I don't mention this in the story when. With carried interest, the carried interest loophole. That was put in so Kyrsten Sinema could take it out. And that got taken out by Sinema, and she let the rest of the bill mostly pass intact. And that was clearly a sacrificial lamb. It wasn't even a good measure. The carried interest measure that Manchin and Schumer put in wouldn't really have done anything. It was really intended as bait for Kyrsten Sinema, and I don't think that was necessarily the process here. I think this was more just the dynamic that happened. But it was very interesting to hear a senator say, yeah, you don't want to be the sacrificial lamb, but at the end of the day, we got to get this thing done.
Right. And her bill is playing a role there.